10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. Good luck, studio.
Hello.
It's the Shy Life Podcast.
All I wanted was a pie, and then I hatched out of an egg.
Okay, bring the mic over. He's ready to record. Hello.
It's the quiet ones you've got to watch, you know.
Is it metaphorical? Is it deep? Is it deep?
Boy, he's not all that shy, is right.
Blimey, Governor, it's the Shy Life Podcast.
Excellent.
611. Bonjour et bienvenue au podcast The Shy Life.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Shy Life Podcast with me, Paul the Shy Yeti. How you doing? I'm alright. So what's this episode going to be about? Well, we're going to be talking books. Books, yes. We've done plenty of book episodes over the years. We've done book clubs. We've done little chats about what I've been reading before. We've also done, well, we looked at a whole bookcase in a spare bedroom last year. But no, this one is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to be going over all of the books that I read in 2022. Yes, I know it's 2023. It's old news. But no, I read 42 books last year. So we're going to have to get busy. We do have a special guest to join us. But yeah, the thing I will say is that I think of the whole 42 books that I read, I enjoyed all of them, or I wouldn't have finished them. I'm pretty bad like that. If I don't like a book, then it would get sort of pushed back. And there were books that I started and didn't finish, so we won't count those. But yeah. Okay, well, let's run that theme music. When we come back, we'll get chatting. Run that theme music.
Darling, it's the Shy Life Podcast.
Yeah, well, it's a positive thing, Paul. The High Life, the Shy Life.
You won't find a cast of characters like this everywhere.
Hello, Paul.
I'll tell you anyway, the potato.
Delicious. Hello, campers. How are you?
You quite like a big fan, don't you, Paul?
Go Shy Yeti.
Oh, I hope he hasn't found out my secret. Do you think he has?
If you thought that was bad, just listen to this.
Yeah, I'm strangely drawn to Yeti Uncle John's ankles as well.
But has the Shy Life Podcast though? I don't think so.
It's all gooey and meaty and yum.
Has anyone seen my hot sausage?
Oh, I can't wait for it to begin.
It's the Shy Life Podcast.
I like that, yeah.
Marvellous, Paul.
Hi there.
So, listeners, yes, 42 books. I was surprised. I haven't read as many as that for goodness knows how long. I couldn't tell you when I last read as many as 42 books. I think partly not regularly working. I spend a lot of my morning reading. And the good thing is, the books that I've read in the last year, often they've been so compelling that I had to read just another one. Or recently I've been sort of going to bed but then reading at the end of the day as well because I want to read more. So yeah, I mean, none of what I read is high art. In fact, I was put off those kind of books when I did GCSE and A-levels at school. Mostly what I'm reading is horror, autobiography. In fact, for a long time, all I read was autobiography. I used to definitely read in my breaks at work, but I never really sort of took note of what I was reading, or how much I was reading, I suppose I should say. And those days at work were the last time I really read sort of physical books. This year, everything has been digital, except for one of the books that I was bought as a birthday present, and then I sort of read it at my parents' after lunch, before afternoon nap. But yeah, so horror, autobiography, yeah, and a sprinkling of other things. But I think they're worth talking about. I've mentioned one or two of them probably in previous episodes, but certainly not the whole 42, so it doesn't hurt to go through the whole list. Yeah, I think I'd recommend them all. Probably when we're talking about them, I might reflect whether they're ones that maybe I would go back and read it again, which really doesn't happen much. The only books I've really read twice have been Tales of the City, which I I keep going back to. But then they're probably my favourite series of books anyway. So, who's our guest? Well, let's get started and you'll see. He needs no introduction.
So, what's this episode going to be about? Well, I'm going to be talking about books, and I've got a special guest. It's Toppy Smelly. Toppy, how are you
Hello.
doing?
I'm good. And in all seriousness, one of the things I wished I would incorporate into my life much more, is reading. So, hats off to you for just reading.
I mean, I've had more time, but yeah, I used to read a lot, and then years went by where I might have read one book a year, but this year, 2022, I read 42 books.
That's awesome.
And I just want to kind of run past a few of them because there's quite a weird and wonderful range, and also some books led to other books, if you know what I mean. I read one and then I thought, or somebody was mentioned, and I was like, I must read a book about that person.
Yeah.
I would say, looking at the books, there's a mixture of autobiographies, a mixture of horror, a mixture of sort of gay themed books. There's a whole mixture, but and there are other books that I'd started and haven't finished. So I'm just talking about the ones that when I looked at my app, that's the other thing I should say. All but one of the books I read digitally, partly because I found with the problems I've had with my rheumatism and things, don't always want to be holding a heavy book and holding it open, and so it's much easier to read it on my phone.
Makes sense. Sense. I have an attachment to the actual physical book.
Yeah.
And I love the smell of particularly pulp paper as it ages. So I would miss those things. But actually, reading books digitally is so convenient, and I mean, it's easy to get them, and so I totally get it.
I was very resistant for a long time, but not that I'm an advert for iPhones, but I do so much with my iPhone, and making phone calls is one of the lesser things.
Yeah.
I take photos, I make videos, I record podcasts, I look at social media and websites, and
if I had to hazard a guess, I think most people with modern phones, including the iPhone, it's text, and the last thing anybody wants to do is actually talk on the phone.
I've gone from being the sort of person who said, I don't want my camera on my phone because if I lose my phone, I've lost everything. Whereas now I'm kind of like, oh no, I don't want a Kindle. I don't want a separate Kindle. I just want everything to be on the one device. So I've totally changed how I thought. Obviously, working in libraries, I was very resistant as well. And the thing is, one of the things that made it sort of cause and effect, I've got so many physical books, which now I don't think about reading so often. But it was always like, I can't get any more physical books. So if I'm going to get new books, it's going to have to be digital ones. But really, I should be reading those physical ones. But with my recent problems, it's not always been possible. Or desirable. Although the very last book I'll mention, which actually was the very last book I read this year, was a physical book because Mr. Nick Goodman bought it me for my birthday, and I read it at my parents' house.
Let me just ask you this because I'm curious. Because I know the Kindle, you've got a fairly big screen, but your phone doesn't. And you've got. How does that go? I mean,
it has a Kindle app. And you can make the typeface. Sorry, is it the typeface? Well, the size of the print. Let's say. Yeah. Sorry, I know.
No, that's legal.
Okay.
That was kosher.
Yeah. You can make the size of the print quite big, so you might only have effectively a quarter of a page on the screen at a time, or you can sort of. You're not like squinting it because it's very small, so you can sort of change that. So I don't find it a problem, but there's a number of books in this list that I've liked the book so much that I kind of stayed up late or read read more of it than I should have been going to bed, but I.
Okay. So just to clarify, this is a list of books you read last year, or this is a list of books you're going to read?
No, this is a list of books that I did read last year.
Oh, okay. All right.
So they're all read, and I can recommend them and say, and I think that is pretty much the case. That I don't think I've read anything that I didn't enjoy, because I think if I wasn't enjoying it, I'm the sort of person that would kind of conveniently kind of forget about it a bit. And the thing is, a lot of these books I was reading in tandem, if that's the right expression. I would kind of rotate between perhaps 3 books and read a few chapters of one, then move over to another one. And particularly if they were autobiographies, it would be a total change of scene anyway. So
I've never done that.
Yeah, but occasionally they'd find a book that I'd be like, oh, I really like this book. So I'd kind of stop reading the other 2 for a few days and then just concentrate on finishing the particular book that was super interesting. But so let's get started, I suppose.
All right.
The first book that I read was called The Grin of the Dark by Ramsey Campbell. And that's a horror book. Ramsey Campbell is often described as like the British Stephen King, but I wouldn't say he's as well known anywhere near as Stephen King. But he's somebody I hadn't read that much of previously. Although I think in 2021 I may have read a book of short stories and maybe another novel. So this wasn't my first Ramsey Campbell, but
and is he like as prolific as King? Or
he's pretty prolific, and he's about in his late 70s and still writing like a book a year or whatever. So I think The Grin of the Dark was from, actually I've got the books on one screen, but I'm also going to get my Kindle app. So if you ask something like I can't answer, I should be able to answer. So the Grin of the Dark was written in 2008. I think you kind of find it interesting because it's about an old sort of Chaplin era silent comic, and who's kind of very obscure. And this guy is sort of trying to find footage of his films, but it's all kind of when he watches the films, trippy things happen, and the films are almost like possessed. It's kind of difficult to almost explain it, but yeah, it was definitely the whole filmmaking side of it and the collecting of rare films, and perhaps the reason why these films weren't widely sort of available might have been, more than a coincidence, if you know what I mean. There was something sinister about them, which was perhaps why they were out of circulation, and trying and hunting them down wasn't going to lead to a good outcome. But I think I found that quite sort of compelling reading.
That does sound interesting.
The next book I read was completely different in that it was an autobiography. It was an autobiography of the singer from this. Well, although you'll know her, but Suzi Quatro.
Yeah.
So it's sort of. I think it was written in like about this. Actually, it's the same year as the previous book. So it goes up to about the late noughties, and obviously it's an autobiography, so it covers sort of what she did before she became famous.
Now, wait, I want to make sure I got the right. Is this the singer that did Pinky Tuscanero on Happy Days?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
But she also had quite a lot of connections with the UK, because before she did Happy Days, she was having hits in the UK, and she was in bands in the 60s, and then she got the opportunity to come over to England, and she had a couple of number one hits around the time I was born. So the Happy Days thing happened a bit later. And I think she's continued. I guess her peak was the 70s and maybe early 80s, but she's still doing albums, still touring, and
still doing it, huh?
Yeah. I can't remember what made. That's one that I'd had on my phone for a while, but I think possibly talking with Martin Holmes about music. Her name. We would have been doing an episode where she, around the time we would have been recording an episode around the time she had her number ones. So that might be why I originally bought the book, or that might have revived the fact that, because we've talked about the 70s anyway, at some point I bought the book and then didn't read it immediately, but then sort of, actually, we mentioned her again. I do like autobiographies of rock stars, particularly female rock stars, because they have to go through so much more than the men. And
Absolutely.
They have to sort of stand up to horrible people.
And also, I don't know if it's reflected in her book, but she's an example of someone who's been recording long enough to go through the whole incredible change in how the music industry works. So I don't know if it gets into that. By the way, I always make a distinction, and I always like to know, and sometimes you don't get the information, but some autobiographies are written by other people based on what they're told.
Yeah.
And some autobiographies are written 100% by the person the book is about. And it doesn't always make a difference, but I'm always curious, like, okay, am I reading an autobiography that this person really wrote, or is she, telling her life to another writer?
Well, they don't always admit to it, do they? But it would appear that she wrote this one.
Okay.
And because she's a little bit, you kind of forget that she's a little bit, for that sort of leather-clad rock chick type look, she was in a way one of the first, because she's a little bit earlier than people like Chrissie Hynde, and she was there that little bit early. You kind of forget that she's not quite as well remembered because her hits didn't continue for as long, even though she was still recording and doing. But yeah, she did kind of get there. Kind of what she's probably a bit unsung, really, and should be more appreciated or more talked about.
Yeah. As she aged as a performer, has she stuck with the leather look?
I think she's still doing sort of quite rocky stuff. Although I think some of her songs, she wasn't beyond doing the odd ballad and stuff as well. But yeah, I mean, so some of her stuff was, I wouldn't say it was heavy rock, but it was it was quite sort of energetic. Certainly her early songs. So the next book is an autobiography by the gay filmmaker Derek Jarman. I'm not sure if he's somebody who is sort of well known beyond the UK. I mean,
I can tell you, I don't recognize the name.
So this book was written during his lifetime, but I think he died in the early 90s of an AIDS-related disease. But he was very sort of like art films and very low-budget films. But I'd read a book of his, which he wrote, a sort of diary from the late 80s, because he bought a shack by the sea in a not 100% scenic sort of area of the UK, quite near a power station. But the diary he wrote, it started off a bit as almost like how he brought that place to life, but then it would jump into sort of anecdotes about films he was making at the time. But this one that I read last year was called "Kicking the Pricks," and it's I think it's from earlier in the 80s, a sort of like an autobiography. I think it's sort of his diaries from the mid 80s, about 1986, and he's sort of constantly struggling to fund the next project he's doing, and there's lots of anecdotes, and it I mean, obviously a lot of things going on in the mid 80s.
Oh, I'd be interested in that, because I love hearing filmmakers talk about their work and how they do it and all that.
Yeah. Next book I read was another autobiography or sort of book of anecdotes. It's by an actress called Phyllida Law. Apologies if I've pronounced that wrong, but she's the mother of Emma Thompson, the actress. She's also, she's her her mother. But so she is one of those people who's probably in a lot of films, maybe even films with Emma Thompson herself, where she might be playing the mother character, or she might be playing. I know they have certainly done films together. They were definitely in a film called Peter's Friends from the early 90s.
It's funny. I just saw an Emma Thompson movie when I was at DJ's.
Yeah.
We watched Saving Mr. Banks or Saving Mrs. Banks. It's Emma Thompson plays the author of Mary Poppins, and the story's about how she finally allowed Walt Disney to make the movie from her property.
Well, this is just a book of anecdotes. The book's called Dead Now, of course, and it's, I guess it's kind of from the sort of thing where you're telling an anecdote about somebody and going, oh, they're dead now, of course. No, I don't think that was a very long book, although sometimes, because I'm reading it digitally, you're not seeing, it's 100 pages, you're seeing screens. So sometimes a long book, it's not always... You're not 100% sure what the book. You almost wonder, was that a thick book I read, or was that a thin book? And I think Dead Now, of course, was a relatively thin book. But
did she work in any American movies, or was she strictly in the UK?
Well, she's still alive. I imagine she has done things. Whether she's done things because Emma brought her along or cast her.
Boy, if she's still alive, she must be up there in age.
Yeah, she is. She was born in 1932, so she's 90. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the anecdotes in this book did come from her early career when she used to sort of doing things on the stage, meeting her husband. So,
was her husband an actor too?
Yeah, he was. He's called Eric Thompson, and he's best known for The Magic Roundabout, which is an animation. Well, it's actually a French animation, but that's a story in itself. In that he did all the characters, but they didn't. For some reason, they didn't have a script, or they didn't know what the French script was. So Eric Thompson just made it up from what the visuals were.
I've heard about this. In fact, I don't know who hipped me to this. It was probably you.
Talked about it. We might have talked about it on the on Chatterbox.
That's what it was. Yep.
Yeah, she's in Nanny McPhee. Was that an American one?
I don't know, but it was definitely played here. Played here.
She's in sort of Saving Grace. She's Anna Karenina, Emma. But I think some of those are ones that Emma Thompson was involved in as well. She's done a lot of TV as well, but more things like Agatha Christie's Poirot or Midsummer Murders or quite
and she's probably started out on stage and then
yes.
Yeah.
I know she's a favourite, but I'm sure at some point you'll cover a movie that or maybe you already have covered a movie on Matinee Manish.
Could be.
So the next book I read was called Under a Dark Angel's Eye. It's the selected stories of Patricia Highsmith. Now, Patricia Highsmith wrote the Talented Mr. Ripley books. Well, which is one of my favourites.
Oh my lord!
I love those books, but I also love the film.
I haven't read it, but I've seen the movie. Talented Mr. Ripley is like one of my nightmares come true. Because for whatever reason, I don't know what this says about me, but I've had so many dreams where I've killed someone and I have to cover it up.
Yeah, I've had one.
Oh, good Lord.
I think in these times where people are getting sort of sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly sort of cancelled or whatever, the introduction sort of saying, she wasn't very nice, but her stories are amazing. And I think if we accept that, we can move on. Because I think she was a complicated person in her private life. I think she was gay, and obviously she's probably gay in a time when it wasn't, and at least initially. I think she lived into the 1990s, but she was still writing in the 1990s. She started in the 50s, and I think she was a little bit self-hating, complicated, but also I think that she might bring bits of that into the stories, but I don't think you don't read her stories and they're full of racist language or anything. She may have been problematic in many ways, but it doesn't in my experience, it doesn't come into the writing in a negative way. So the stories are really good, and also they cover a big period, I think, and they're all quite different in twists, and it was really good. It was a really good collection.
Oh, these were short stories.
These were short stories, yeah. I'd actually bought it in hard copy for Toby, but then I kind of thought, well, I'm not sure I want to read, because it was quite thick. I don't know if I want to read his copy, and also I've got to wait for him to finish it, and I kind of want to get started as well. So I just bought myself a digital copy as well. But, I enjoyed it.
Do you like short stories? Are you a fan of short stories? I mean, you've written so many short stories yourself.
Yeah, I am. And when I went back to writing short stories, I kind of got myself back into the habit by reading quite a lot of short stories, just to kind of get back, because you realise it's a skill in itself. And I also wrote very short, like 100-word stories, which you really have to kind of get in there with you're almost starting just before the twist at the end. So you have to kind of, it's a bit like telling a joke. You have to kind of get it all in there quickly before the readers even have a chance to go, oh, I know what he's doing. You have to, if you're going to have a twist in the end, you have to kind of keep your cards close to your chest and not drag it on so long that I remember reading one, I mentioned this before, I remember reading a short story from perhaps the 50s, and it was quite a long short story. It took about a fifth of the book. And it was about a werewolf, quite clearly about a werewolf, and it was quite clear that it was the Lord of the Manor who's the werewolf, and it took such a long time to tell the story that you guessed it all. But I guess it was written at a time when people wouldn't be going or second guessing and going, oh, this is the werewolf story. A bit like, it must have been a big shock to have a vampire in Dark Shadows when that happened. Whereas now, people would be used to the signs of and it wouldn't be a shock that, oh, there's a vampire coming into the show. Whereas,
yeah, I know what you mean, because they took their time telling Barnabas's introduction. They took their time actually confirming that this is a vampire. I mean, it was a while. He was on there a while before he, and of course now, I mean, people probably pick up on it right away or reasonably soon, but at the time, maybe it came as a surprise to a lot of people. I don't know.
It's definitely a talent. The next book I read, it's a horror author I'd never tried before, called Stephen Graham Jones. I think he's American, but I may be wrong. The book was called Night of the Mannequins. It was kind of a bit of almost like a comedy horror to a certain extent. And I wasn't that could be a bit of a difficult genre. Sometimes I'm kind of, no, I want my horror to be, I want my horror to be 100% horror. Although I can talk, because most of the things I do have a hint of humour, if not a massive dollop of humour. So, true. But I don't know if I always like it. That's what I do. I don't necessarily want to be reading it or watching a film that's comedy horror. I have to be in the mood, because I'm involved in that quite a lot.
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
So I'll just read a little bit of the description. It's a contemporary horror story where a teen prank goes very wrong and all hell breaks loose. Is there a supernatural cause, a psychopath on the loose, or both? It all got a bit trippy and weird, and it was to do with a mannequin being left. So somebody thought that, oh, it's a real person, a real body sort of thing. But then I think the mannequin became alive, or was it imagined? So it all became a bit sort of, where's this going? Actually, I'm surprised, because this is one of those books that I didn't realise was so short. It's only 138 pages. But yeah, I mean, I definitely read some others by Stephen Graham Jones. When was it published? 2020. I think he's written quite a few books. But so after that, I read. I'll group them together. That there was a book in between them, but I might as well mention both at the same time. I read 2 Stephen King books, but they were shorter ones, and they were in his they were supposed to be more crime. One was called Later, and one was called Joyland, and they were both written, I think, in the 2010s. The thing is, I really enjoyed them, but they were both in a sort of crime imprint rather than horror. But they both had a certain amount of horror, sci-fi sort of in them. So I kind of thought I wouldn't say that they were 100% crime, because Later definitely had a character who was had a boy who sort of got premonitions about bad things that were going to happen. And Joyland was about a fairground where a murder had happened. And again, the character was kind of trying to find out, they never found the killer at this fairground. So it was more than just crime, which is probably why I really enjoyed them both, because they weren't deadpan 100% crime. They still had the Stephen King touch. The thing about Stephen King I find these days is that I'm a bit put off by the really massive long ones, which are probably the ones I've not read yet. There are quite a few of his I've not read which are massive, and I think in a way reading them digitally, kind of you forget that they're massive. It breaks it down a bit. You're not faced by this enormous book that you're carrying.
I attempted. I've read a lot of King, probably more than any other author, because I only say it that way because, there are a hell of a lot of authors out there and a hell of a lot of books. And sometimes I'm a little embarrassed that I've read so much King. I mean, he's popular. I get it. I can't think of anything I've read of his that I didn't like. But it's like, come on, expose yourself to someone else besides King. Anyway, I tried to read The Stand. And I got so far, and I just never finished it. It's the only long one I've ever tried to tackle.
Well, I did read one other, but we'll come to that later, and that was one that's quite long. But I read a lot of his books in the late 80s, around the time that Tommyknockers came out, because I used to go to Nick and I have talked about a bookshop we used to go to, and I remember them having like one of those displays for Tommyknocker, and that was the first one I read. And then I read quite a lot around that time. In the mid-90s, I worked in a library which had fiction, even though it wasn't a fiction library as such, but because there were students living on campus, they had fiction, and that allowed me to try lots of different writers. And I I kind of moved on a bit from Stephen King. And then in about 2000 and, the late noughties, I decided to read Salem's Lot, which I'd not read. And then again had another period of reading quite a few of his and reading his short stories, which obviously was another, when I was thinking of writing short stories, I thought, Stephen King would be a good person to read to kind of get me back into short stories.
I think Salem's Lot may have been my first King book that I read. I think it was.
I don't think Tommyknockers was necessarily the best place to start, just it was the newest one at the time. But the good thing about Joyland and later is that they were much slimmer volumes, of no more than 200 pages, I wouldn't have thought. In fact, I did go and buy a copy. I liked Joyland best out of those two, and actually I just found that there was a nice hardback edition with extra illustrations and things. So I actually bought that in hard, because I thought, this would be a nice one to keep, because this would be the trouble about having the books digitally is you can't lend them to people. I'm not sure that Toby would always want to read a book I recommended, but he might do. But I'm not going to give him my phone and say read it on my phone. So, with Joyland, I thought, no, I really like this, and it would be nice if he could read it one day. Now, the book I read between later and Joyland was We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. And I know she wrote, was it The Haunting of Hill House? And she wrote The Lottery. She wrote short stories, and she wrote a number of novels, but she died quite young in the early 60s. I think We Have Always Lived in the Castle is one of her last books. It got made into a film relatively recently.
Did you know that last segment of Dark Shadows where Frid didn't play Barnabas, he played someone else? That was based on The Lottery.
Yeah, we have always lived in the castle. Is about this weird family living in this house where they've kind of been cut off from the local community, and it's written from the point of view. I think it's written from the point of view of one of the youngest characters. But she's certainly the central. Whether it's written in the first person or I can't quite remember. But it's a really good book. I wish we'd done something like that at school. I mean, I guess at the time it would only have been about 20 years old, so maybe not considered. And actually, my mum would have been working in libraries in the early 60s, and I don't think Shirley Jackson was a name that she knew particularly well. So I don't know how this is one of those things where her name has got more popular since she's died over here.
Oh, you know what? All this time, I don't think I knew your mother was a librarian.
Yeah, and so was my aunt and my uncle. My dad's brother was a librarian, and his wife was a librarian. So it was kind of foretold that one of us ought to be.
I guess.
But now, moving on, I don't want some of these ones. I'll move on quicker because they're quite short books. I read a book called Assigned which is about the TV show Sapphire and Steel, which is that show with Joanna Lumley and David McCallum from the late 70s.
Yeah.
Sort of weird.
It was like about the making of it and all that?
Yes, that's right, behind the scenes. There was only 6 stories with multiple episodes, but it was sort of behind the scenes things. And so I read that. Then I read a book called The King of Fools by Frederick Dard, who's a French writer from the sort of 50s, 60s, probably more than that. But Toby sort of turned me onto this because it was by an imprint that kind of does translations and he had read some that were like Japanese thrillers and books that were kind of like a Japanese version of it, and then there were none or something by Agatha Christie. And Frederick Dard wrote some really good, quite thin thrillers, probably pulp stuff that we just pick up. But there's only about 7 or 8 of his novels translated into English. I really enjoyed them, and I ended up buying every one I could find. And the first one I read was called The King of Fools. And I won't go too much into the plot, but it was just they were just interesting little thrillers, nice twists, and actually it probably means I read more than 42 books, because one of the ones we'll come to, it was like 4 books in one. So I must have read every single book by Frederick Dard that's available in but I think he wrote loads and loads of them. So I just hope they translate more of them. But there were 1 or 2 where mostly I found them, you couldn't necessarily tell that they were written in the 50s. But 1 or 2 you could, because that the attitude to the men, to the women was a bit sort of, I'm the man, you're the woman sort of thing. But I think we're more used to we accept that a book is set in a certain time. We don't get too upset. We know that that's how things used to be. But ultimately, you're reading it knowing that it's written from a different. It's not written today.
I was just going to interject. My only French novel that I've ever read was Pierre Boile's Planet of the Apes, which I don't think was the original title. I mean, it was obviously it had a title in French, but I don't think it translated to Planet of the Apes. I can't remember what it was. But anyways, I was such a Planet of the Apes freak. I read the novel that they were all based on.
Actually, my I know you'd probably be less interested perhaps by the more recent ones. You're talking more about the 70s ones, I guess. But my friend Patrick, who has briefly been on the show and works in film, is currently working, I think, in Australia on what's going to be the next Planet of the Apes film.
Yeah, goodness.
That's an exclusive. I don't even know when it's coming out. But last time I heard from him, he was in some hot place in Australia, involved in the making of the next Planet of the Apes movie. But,
cool.
I can't take any credit, but he was in some part. The next book I read was another Ramsey Campbell, and I think it was his. Actually, no, it wasn't his most recent one, but it was. I think it was one from a number 2 or 3 years ago. It was called 13 Days by Sunset Beach, which doesn't necessarily conjure up horror. But it was kind of about a family, an extended family going to, I guess it was sort of like a Greek island. I don't know, I can't remember now whether it was a real island or whether it was a made-up island. But it was an island where sort of weird things happened after dark, and it was sort of menace. The only trouble was where I felt it fell down was that I don't like to say this about somebody who's obviously an established writer who's been writing for years. Sometimes I find his dialogue is not his strong point, and he had so many characters in that book because of the families, and the families, like there'd be a wife and a kid, and then there'd be a mother and a father and kids, and so there must have been like 10 characters, and they weren't all. It was more because it was about a family holiday, but they didn't all play that big a part really. There were just a bit too many characters, I felt. But I did really enjoy the book, but it was a little bit overstuffed with the holiday makers. But so my next 2 were Doctor Who related. One was a novelization. They used to novelize back in the day all of the Doctor Who stories of the original series. I mean, in fact, when I was growing up, that was how I knew about the stories I hadn't seen, because you buy the novel. But I don't know if it was to do with rights and things. Some of them never got novelized, 1 or 2. This one, City of Death, was a story that Douglas Adams, who wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because he was a script editor on Doctor Who, and he wrote City of Death, but he never got novelized by him in his lifetime. They finally novelized the 4 or 5 stories that never got novelized for whatever reason. It was novelized by a writer called James Goss, or Ghost, I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced, but he kept because it was written by Douglas Adams, who's a very quirky kind of guy anyway. There were lots of funny lines in the original. It was a Tom Baker story set in Paris and actually filmed in Paris in 1979. And it's one of the stories that's considered to be one of the best. And there were lots of funny lines, quirky lines, and all of those were retained. But I think he did a really good job without changing the story. He brought some funny lines or descriptions, because obviously, writing the novel, you got to kind of just describe a lot more than where the TV version, it's all there in front of you.
Right.
And so I enjoyed that. And the other Doctor Who book I read was a production diary written by. It came from notes. There was a producer, the last producer of the original Doctor Who was John Nathan Turner, was the producer from about 79 till 1990, and it was all based on notes and things that he'd just sort of his production diary. It was quite just little bits and pieces I didn't know. Sort of interesting. I got through that quite quickly. There's an autobiography because John Nathan Turner was openly gay in the 80s and sometimes was accused of being sort of stunt casting, having famous people in Doctor Who, hoping it would get attention. And sometimes people being cast in roles where you think that actor playing that sort of character, but sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And he was involved with the show at a time when the BBC was losing interest, and found that when he wanted to leave, they were kind of like, you either do Doctor Who or we haven't got anything else for you. And and so he kind of stayed longer than he got a lot of. I remember in fandom he got a lot of stick from certain areas of fandom, but I liked a lot of what he did. So not everything, but a lot.
I got a quick question for you about Doctor Who novels. I'm just assuming that, like Star Trek, there are vast numbers of Doctor Who novels, that were never part of the show or turned into the show or based on a show's episode. But like Star Trek has a whole universe of novels that are the characters, but it's not from, it's not a story from the actual TV show or movies. Do they do that with Doctor Who?
Yeah, I'd say that happened more after the show finished the first time. In the novels that came out in the 70s and 80s were usually, they were based on the actual TV episodes. But then one of the ways the show was continued after it stopped on TV was that, they started to allow them to do original stories and carry on, like Sylvester McCoy's Doctor, after the show had stopped, but they still wrote book stories with what was the current Doctor, effectively. And also, since it came back, there's been a lot of novels, spin-offs.
Just one more question. So I don't know the answer to this in terms of Star Trek. But like as far as fandom is concerned, I don't know if they all. I mean, I'm sure there's disagreement, but I don't know if they're the books that are not based on the show are considered canon or not. I don't know how they feel about it. What do you make of the Doctor Who novels where, they're a thing unto themselves? Do they?
I would say they're not considered canon, except on a couple of occasions they did turn novels, like when it came back, there were one or two stories that are based on popular novels that were written. But they changed the Doctor and maybe made it David Tennant's Doctor instead of the. But I think also in some of the novels they've killed off characters, like for instance Sylvester McCoy's companion Ace. I think she got killed off in a novel, maybe more than once. But in the actual canon version of Doctor Who, Ace came back in that last Jodie Whittaker story, so Ace isn't dead at all. So, so that, but we didn't know for many years. So you could have said, "Oh well, that's how I see it finishing." But now she's been in it again. That definitely makes those books non-canon. But which I think they probably always were to a certain extent. But, moving on to the next one, I won't stop very long, but this is Frederick Dard again, that French writer. And this is this 4 books: The Gravediggers, Bread, The Bird in a Cage, Crush, and The Executioner Weeps. They're all very different and sort of set in 50s, 60s France and thrillers. And I mean, the whole 4 books together is only 400 and something pages, so they were probably only like 100-page novels. So, but yeah, I enjoyed them. The next book I read, I think it was a debut novel. It was called Mrs. March by Virginia Fieto. Sorry if I've not pronounced that right. I just think I picked it up because it was sort of described as being a bit like a Patricia Highsmith novel, and it's about a woman slowly unraveling, living in a marriage. I enjoyed it, but there was a point where I was kind of thinking, where is this leading? What is this literally just going to be more? Where's this headed? Basically, she was unraveling. I wasn't quite sure where it was going to lead to. I hesitate to say it was my least enjoyed book this year, but I definitely struggled, and it wasn't because it was very easy to read, but I just wasn't. I don't know whether I would read another book by her. Well, there's nothing wrong with her writing. She was very, but I don't know. I sort of, and I can't remember how it ended now, but I did finish it. but I liked the. I guess I started off definitely liking the sort of, definitely that sort of style. You could have been reading a Patricia Highsmith novel, but yeah, it took a little while to get going. It's a Sunday Times bestseller, so what do I know? The next book I read was by another horror writer who I've never heard of before, who I think is also American, Bentley Little. And the book was called The Haunted, and it was about a family moving into a house where the bad things happen, which obviously you know it's quite familiar territory, but
yeah,
it was quite. I did enjoy it, and I probably, I mean, some of these books, some of these writers, if I liked the book I was reading, I have got another book by them to read later on my phone. So I think I definitely bought another book of his. Although the only thing I will say, and it's nothing, it's just personal choice, not a negative thing really, but I found that most of his books are one-word titles or very, I mean, and I just don't like that. I don't like books with. I just find them very, very easy to kind of like forget, or you know, where they're just one word. Like I can't even think of examples. but you know, my titles are often very complicated, and and you won't find many other things called those. But I just find, I mean, The Haunted. There's probably a million books. It's a title. I just wish he'd come up with more exciting titles, but
it's funny. I've learned that about you from previous conversations about the short titles.
Yeah.
And I've named many a Smellcast episode the something, the car, the journey.
but you've also had a few that are more complicated as well. So
yeah.
The next book I read was called Good Pop, Bad Pop by a singer called Jarvis Cocker, who probably isn't so well known outside of the UK. He was in a band called Pulp, who did a big song called Common People, but in the mid-90s. And I was very keen on their band. And this is basically, well, it was a sort of autobiography, but it came from the point of view, and I think this is where you might find it quite interesting. He was clearing a loft in a house where he I don't know if he was moving out or what he was doing, but anyway, he was a hoarder basically, and he tells us stories. But oh look, I found this box of matches from 1974. I kept this because I love the logo. And then there's an anecdote, and there's lots of these little items and little anecdotes, and also it's a bit of an autobiography and about being in the band. And I also watched a live stream. He did a show in London where I guess it was to promote the book, and you probably got the book signed, but I wasn't really up for going into London and going to a theatre and seeing him do that, because it was sort of, I just quite happy to sit and watch the live stream from here, really. I mean, but yeah, it was interesting to him talking about. Yeah, I hope he does another book, because it didn't cover the whole of. I think it doesn't even, because his group Pulp were around a long time before they had big success. They didn't have success until the 90s, but they started in the very late 70s. So there's lots more to be told, I would have thought, and probably lots more anecdotes and items to be discussed. But,
that sounds like a good one to me.
now the next two books, I won't go into the plots, but another horror writer who I hadn't read for ages, Dean Koontz. Although when I used to read Dean Koontz, he was Dean R. Koontz, but he seems like he's just Dean Koontz these days. But,
I've never known him with the R. That's interesting.
I read one called The Other Emily, which I think was written more recently, and one called The Face of Fear, which I think is from the 70s. It's possible that I'd read that one before, because, but it's been such a long time. I think I read Dean Koontz around the same time as I got into Stephen King, because my friend Lee, who was in Sutton Park, recommended me Dean Koontz.
Yeah, I link Koontz to King as well, because their subjects are similar, and I've probably read, after King, probably the author I've read the most is probably Koontz.
I hadn't read any for a long time, and The Face of Fear is one where a lot of the books set in a big office block, and these two characters being stalked by this. It does get a bit over the top, but I think the guy is a mountain climber, so they're kind of scaling down this big office block, and the guy's trying to shoot them, and it's quite visual and quite filmic, really. The Other Emily was more about somebody, I think, clones, and it was a bit more sci-fi. I enjoyed both of them, and what I really like is these chapters are nice and short, so you read one and then you're kind of like, I'll just read one more. I'll just read one. The book I read after that was the latest David Sedaris, Happy Go Lucky.
Oh, I love him.
Yeah. That was, I think the theme of this one, I would say, was his father dying, or things his father did in the last years of his life. It was very good, as always.
I'm such a fan of his work. It's one of my favorite kinds of I don't know, observational writing that's purportedly, like, usually his stuff is about stuff that really happened or he's really lived, and I just love that kind of story and that kind of writing.
Moving on, because we've still got a few more to go, but we're getting through them. I read another Frederick Dard called The Wicked Go to Hell, which I think it was sort of about two prisoners who had escaped, and you knew that one of them was a policeman in disguise who'd been trying to get a confession out of the other one, but you didn't know which of the two was the policeman out of the two that escaped. So that was quite good. That was the last of the Frederick Dard books that I had. Then I read an autobiography by Celia Imrie called The Happy Hoofer, and she's an actress that I really like, mainly a comic actress. You've probably seen her in British films.
What's her name?
She's Celia Imrie.
Okay.
Celia, then Imrie. She was in a lot of TV, but she's in a lot of movies, sort of British comedy type films. I think she's just turned 70, so she's been around since she's been around since probably the 70s, but she started to become well known in the 80s.
Yeah, and Hofer is, the way I take that is, it's like a stage actor, somebody's gone through, I don't know how it's related, but she definitely did work on the stage in the early days of her career. She's one of my favorites. She's funny. Then I tried a book called Horror Store, and it's by a horror writer called Grady Hendrix, who, again, I think American. It's a horror story. It's a bit one of those. It's a bit like that other one where it's a little bit. It's not exactly comedy, but it's a little bit tongue in cheek. It's sort of set in a sort of IKEA type, like one of those sort of stores. But it's also on the mouth of like a hell mouth, for the want of a better description. And so it's all kind of. It's not as comedy as, but the actual book is kind of styled like if you went to IKEA and you picked up one of their manuals or something, or like a sort of advertising sort of brochure. The actual
I think I do have both versions. I think I do have the hard copy version of that because it's a thing of beauty in itself, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
Then I read a book by Aidan Chambers called Dance on My Grave, and I read that because it was based on a film I'd seen called Summer of '85, and it got me a bit into the sort of genre of gay teen romance type things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about. It is actually described as a sort of book for late teenage, not dead teenagers, a book for older teenagers. But in a way, I always found that's a bit of a shame because just because the kid like 17 or 18 doesn't mean to say you can't enjoy it as an adult.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a novel, but I guess it's nice also if it can be targeted towards younger adults as well.
Oh, yeah.
But
I mean, think of Harry Potter was targeted to children, but goodness knows adults read the hell out of it too.
Well, I really enjoyed the film, and I really enjoyed the book, and I read another Aidan James book coming up. But after that, though, I read another Grady Hendrix book, the guy who wrote the Horror Store book, but this was actually a factual book. It's called Paperbacks from Hell, and it was literally a history of mass paperbacks from about the 60s to whenever they stopped being, like really ridiculous titles, and how you get sort of, you just have genres of a sort of like crazy animals attacking type books, or vampire books, or gothic romance books. The ones that would just be pulped out and they'd just be at every supermarket, and they went through a really popular phase in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the stories are just ridiculous. And it was just a history of those books, and I just saw it and thought, this sounds like something I'd enjoy.
That sounds fascinating.
But actually getting hold of some of the books that's harder, because a lot of them are out of print. I mean, they're probably books that you'd recognise, or at least some of them, because him being an American writer, he was focusing more on American pulp paperback horror.
Mm-hmm. I admit to a weakness for what I call my trashy novels. They're so stupid, Paul. They're so horrible. But I read them. But they're trashy romance novels. Oh my God, Jesus!
I've had like phases like that.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like especially if it's like written from a female point of view, or female friendships and sort of soapiness sort of plots.
I mean, they're just churned out and printed in paperback. They never have a hardcover.
Well, following that, I read Otherwise Engaged by Donald Spoto. It's the life of the actor Alan Bates, who was, I guess, I think he lived to the early noughties. He was in a lot of films in the 50s and 60s, and he was a bit of a heartthrob. But he also, I think he was bisexual. I think he was married, but I mean, I think he had very passionate relationships with women, but he had very passionate relationships with men as well. But he was also a bit sort of guarded at times. I don't think he ever had a conversation about I am gay, but everybody knew that he was.
So was this
male lovers?
Was this an autobiography?
No, this was a biography.
Okay.
I'm just trying to.
I wonder if this is this Spoto. The name I remember there has written many books about movies and film, right?
I don't know that. But yes, quite possibly. I think it's supposed to be quite a good biography. So I think he's probably. I think it was one. Again, I probably saw it mentioned in one book or something triggered me off.
Yeah, Spoto. I think if it's the guy I'm thinking of, that's what he writes about. He writes about the movie industry and cinema.
He was in things like Whistle Down the Wind, Georgie Girl, Women in Love.
And what was the name of that actor again?
Alan Bates.
Gee, that sure sounds familiar.
An Englishman Abroad. Prayer for the Dying. I mean, he was in American movies as well. Prince and the Pauper, Mothman Prophecies.
Oh, okay.
The Gosford Park was in. Can't remember exactly what led me to pick up the book, but I think obviously knowing that he had that sort of he had the bisexual side made me sort of curious.
Oh my! I'm Googling him because I want to see his face, and one of the things that one of the things that came up is Alan Bates and Oliver Reed wrestling clip. I'm not sure I want to see that.
Yeah, that was one of his famous movies. Then,
wait a minute now. I just saw his face. Good Lord, do I recognize him? My goodness.
He did eventually do American movies, but I think he's probably better known over here to start with.
No, not a familiar face. Huh.
Well, moving on, I read 2 books by the same author in a row. I read Sliver and The Stepford Wives by R11. I do love R11 things. I have pretty much all of his books, I think. I mean, I love The Stepford Wives, the movie, anyway. And I love Rosemary's Baby. And he wrote so many interesting... if you like one R11 film or book, you'll probably like another one. They're all and Sliver I didn't know about. I've seen the movie with Sharon Stone, which was a bit dreadful because they changed some of the things in the book.
What movie was Sharon Stone in?
Sliver.
From
about 93, set in a big block of flats, but they mucked around with it and split characters into 2 characters, and the book was far more satisfying. I did kind of make sure I bought all of R11's books.
Mm-hmm.
I've been going through them, but those are the 2 I read this year.
I bet Rosemary's Baby is a good read.
Yeah, I think I've read that before, but a long time ago, so I should be reading that one again. So the next book I read was called My Best Friend's Exorcism. The cover is done like it's designed like it's a VHS video cover, like it's I think it's Grady Hendrix again, but I can't quite read the title. I think I'm sure it is. So it was a little bit tongue in cheek, a little bit. I mean, it's basically what it says on the title, My Best Friend's Exorcism. It was enjoyable. I have a feeling they're making a film out of it. So coming to the last few now. The next one I read was another Aidan Chambers book, the guy who wrote Dance on My Grave. It was called The Toll Bridge, and it was about some teens living on this bridge, which had been a toll bridge, and the sort of how the characters sort of there's a girl and 2 boys, and there's a sort of bit of a love triangle going on, and yeah, again, it's meant for sort of older teens, but I really enjoyed it, and I've got a couple more of his books to read. Following that, I read another Ramsey Campbell, and it was the one that he wrote this year. It came out towards the end of the year. It was called Fellstones. Again, it was a bit about a weird village where a character sort of had suppressed. Well, he'd lived at that village with this family after his parents had died, but he'd kind of found them very intense when he got to the age where he wanted to leave. They were a bit resistant to it, and he kind of cut himself totally off. But he slowly sort of reconnected with them, and that was a bad idea. It was quite atmospheric, but again, I found the dialogue was a little bit weird in a way that helped because it made you feel, well, there's something a bit creepy about this. But yeah, I wasn't sure how much of it was deliberate and how much of it was his style is just kind of. I think I have read articles that sort of said he almost does it deliberately to give you a sort of weird sort of, something's not quite right here. Like, like when you have a dream and things in dreams, everything seems normal, but they're not quite normal.
Definitely. Mm-hmm.
After I read that, now the next book I read, I read this for quite a long time because this is the book that was quite a big book. I read Stephen King's Christine.
Oh.
Yeah, it took me quite a long time to get through Christine because it was so long. But yeah, I definitely enjoyed it. I think I had always been put off by it because I thought, the car coming to life is going to be. I don't think I want to read it. I don't think it's going to be very interesting. But actually, it was really interesting. It was.
I imagine it's better than the movie. I didn't know Christine was one of his longer books because the movie's really just a little wisp of a story.
Yeah, I mean,
it surprises me that the novel isn't one of his longer ones.
Let me have a look. I don't think it's like 1,000-page long. But,
yeah.
737. That's pretty long.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's pretty long. But it was good. Now the next 2 I read were biographies. No, actually they're autobiographies. One of them was called Fingers Crossed by a singer called Mickey Bereni. I don't know if that's pronounced right. She was a sort of indie rock bands in the sort of 80s and 90s. They were never massively famous, but and then also they're definitely UK. But it was actually really interesting. I kind of bought it because I thought, well, I like hearing about, again, the music scene she was in was quite male orientated, and they were one of the few female fronted bands. But I also found it quite interesting because her mother was an actress who would perhaps be, well, was definitely in things like James Bond films. She might have been one of the girls around the pool, not necessarily having big speaking parts, but she was in the movie industry. And her father was quite eccentric and her grandmother was very eccentric. And her mother, when she divorced her father, married a guy who did stunt coordination on the Avengers, and then also went on to being a director and things like Heart to Heart. And so there was a lot of stuff that wasn't that she was reacting to from her. So before I even got to the music, a lot of her upbringing was, her mother was quite strict when she went to stay with her mother, but her father was kind of the opposite and was seeing multiple women, and it was all kind of it was very, I didn't expect it to be as enjoyable as it was, because I didn't know about how traumatic her childhood. But yeah, I really enjoyed that. And then
I just want to say it's just odd that the connection to Heart, because just the last 2 nights, for the first time, I visited that show and I saw the first season of Heart to Heart. Oh my goodness!
Yeah, I think I've got that on DVD somewhere. I might even have the second season somewhere. The next autobiography I read was a more famous singer, Melanie C. The book's called Who Am I? My Story. She was one of the Spice Girls. She was Sporty Spice. And I've always I wasn't a massive Spice Girls fan. I liked the odd song of theirs, but I like quite a lot of her solo stuff. And every time I've heard her on podcasts, and she seems to be a decent sort of, she's had her demons, she's had her problems, but she just seems like quite a warm sort of person. So I thought, yeah, I'll give that a go. I don't usually necessarily buy those sort of really famous sort of autobiographies, but yeah, it was really enjoyable, and yeah, her personality definitely came through. She seemed very much sort of grounded, sort of, I was just a girl from a council estate sort of thing, and not all full of sort of, ego and things. Then I read an Agatha Christie. I may have read years ago, but I hadn't read. A friend of mine, Charlie, is very into Agatha Christie, and you might remember that my mum has that phone box opposite their house with all the books and all the. They got a big bag of Agatha Christie stuff, and some of them I brought back for Toby. A couple of them I said to Charlie, because it's nice to have them, but we don't necessarily need hard copies of them. But talking about Agatha Christie again with Charlie kind of made me think, I quite like to read some Agatha Christie again, because I was a really big Agatha Christie fan in the early 80s. And I read I used to like Miss Marple more than Poirot, so I read a Miss Marple called Nemesis, where she's been sent on a coach trip by a guy who has since died, and he wanted her to work out about a murder that happened and had affected his son, or his son had been implicated, and he sort of, in his will, he'd sort of challenged her to try and solve it. It's quite a fun one. But at the same time, I also read there was a book that came out late last year called Marple 12 New Stories, like short stories with not written by Agatha Christie, but written by quite famous. They were all female writers. Their take on Miss Marple. And my friend Charlie, he also got the book, and it was the nearest we got to like a book club, in that he would read it. Well, I think he actually got the talking book. I read it, but then we sort of talked about each story, and we thought some of the writers got her really well, and some of them had picked on certain traits that may have only been mentioned in one book, and then made it that they all seemed to be sending her on travels. She went to New York in one of the short stories. She went to Italy. She went to, and in the book I read, Nemesis, she commented, or the character that had been commented, that she rarely had travelled. So I think because she did it once, some people, I don't know how many of the writers were big fans of Miss Marple, or whether they just accepted the job because they'd been asked, and it was a prestigious thing to be asked to do. But certainly some people did it better than others. But it was. They were interesting stories. They were quite enjoyable. But
I wonder if it just strikes me, are Agatha Christie books coming into the public domain? Maybe that's why. Is that possible?
I'm not sure. And also, there were some really good adaptations in the 80s with a really good actress playing Miss Marple, but then in the noughties they did it, and they kind of, whoever manages the estate these days seems to be quite happy for them to change things, and they even sort of would take a Hercule Poirot story and just stick Miss Marple in instead. And I never watched those because I didn't like the sound of that, because the 80s versions were so well done. It just felt sort of they should be done properly. I'm sure they're good fun, but I'm not sure how respectful they are to the original. Now, the next book I read, I think we're coming to the last few now, because I think these are ones I read quite late in the year. I read a book called The Night of the Triffids, which was written, I think, in the early 10s. I think it was around the 50th anniversary of Day of the Triffids, the John Wyndham book. And it was written by someone called Simon Clarke, who I don't know much about, although I think he has been involved in writing Doctor Who, and plus lots of other things. But I did see that he had some connection to Doctor Who. But it was sort of a sequel to Day of the Triffids, and actually ended up in New York and all sorts of. It was. In some ways, it reminded me a bit of some of those Frederick Dard books, but with Triffids. It was quite ambitious, quite interesting. They certainly developed the Triffids beyond what was done in the first book. And it was the main character from Day of the Triffids. It was his son, and that character, the original character, was still there as an old man, but it was mainly the main character was a younger. This was the son of the main character from the original. Moving very quickly on. I read another autobiography called Verse Chorus Monster, and it was by Graham Coxon, who was a guitarist in a band called Blur in the 90s. And I mean, he still does music now, but I was very keen on Blur in the middle 90s when I was started going to gigs and things. So it was interesting to hear. He would have been around at the same sort of time as the girl I mentioned who had the hectic family. So they would have been on the music scene at a similar time. So it was quite good reading them around at the same time. I think we're into the last 3 books now, and 2 of them are autobiographies. Well, actually, the funny thing is, the next book that I finished, I started to read because of the last book I finished. Let me explain. I was reading some Joan Collins, a book. This was the only book I read in hardback or like in physical. I read an autobiography. Well, it was a diaries of Joan Collins from about the late 80s to about 2009. And she mentioned this British actor called Christopher Biggins. Well, I mean, Joan Collins is British as well, although I'm sure she must have had American residency at some point. But Christopher Biggins was in kids' TV, and he was in lots of British programs in the 70s and 80s. And yet he comes from my hometown. He's openly gay, and he met Joan Collins in the early 90s, and they became massive buddies and big friends. And so I was reading Joan Collins' diary and thinking, how did they meet? And she's super famous compared to him being doing okay and doing stage work, and he often played the dame in pantomime, and he was in lots of things, but he was not the best man in the world. He wasn't the same league as Joan Collins when she was at her height. So how did they come? I mean, that's what I like about autobiographies is how did how did so and so become friends with so and so? So I thought I need to see if I need to get a book of I need to get a autobiography of Christopher Biggins if there was one, and there was. And I ended up reading that and finishing that before I finished reading the Joan Collins one. So he sort of overtook her, even though it was her book that made me buy his book. And he, going to parties with people, he was at parties where towards the end of, in America, where Frank Sinatra was there, and he asked Christopher Biggins to kind of keep an eye out. My wife doesn't know I smoke still, and things like that. And just bizarre. You'd never think that he would have been at a party with Frank Sinatra. It is weird sometimes how these people meet and become friends, even if they're completely different parts of the entertainment business. But yeah, so I enjoyed that, and I enjoyed the Joan Collins one. But the last actual book I read, which was fiction, I read because I saw the film, and it's called My Policeman, and it's set in 1950s Brighton, and it's a gay love story between a young guy who's a policeman and this guy who works in the museum. Of course, in the 1950s, being gay was against the law, and so it's all very hush-hush. And the policeman decides to get married to have a sort of a cover and it jumped.
Married to a Woman.
Yes, that's right. So yeah, so I saw the film first, and I found it really compelling and really good. And I thought, well, I want to read the book as well. And the book was just as good, and it was a very accurate adaptation. I was reading the book and thinking, oh yes, I remember this scene. These are actually the lines that they said. There was only very slight differences. Rupert Everett was in it. It shows how time has passed. He was playing the old version of the guy who worked in the museum, because it jumps from the 50s. The more modern scenes are set in the 90s, and it's all about how how their relationships found out, and how the wife reacts, and how all their lives are affected. And it's I mean, the film's definitely worth checking. Maybe one for Matinee Minutia at some point. Although I know it's a bit recent, but it's very recent. But I heard it described as sort of Brokeback Mountain set in Brighton, 1950s Brighton. But I don't know. My memory of Brokeback Mountain is that there's no happy ending whatsoever, whereas there's a little bit more hope, even though it's a little bit sad in My Policeman. But again, I liked the author, Bethan Roberts. I liked her book, and I bought one or two. I'm actually reading another of her books at the moment. But yeah, that's my 42 or more books.
Excellent.
I didn't think we'd get through that so quickly. I mean, relatively quickly.
No, that's great. I encourage you to. I mean, obviously you're enjoying it, so you'll be reading maybe another 42 books this year or more.
I've got 4 on the go at the moment. But anyway, I might tell you a little bit about what I'm reading after we ought to say goodbye. And I might just come back for a minute or two, and I might tell you a little bit about what I'm reading. But anyway, Toppy, thank you for joining me and for listening to me ramble on about all these books. But I recommend them all, really.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. I found it very interesting.
Yeah, we'll be back again soon, listeners, and Toppy will be back. It's nice that Toppy gets to sit down with a cup of coffee and to talk about books. I'm not bombarding him with yoga vampires, or we're not running or posing for Instagram or going up in a spaceship. So just time to sit and relax. Anyway, we'll say goodbye for now, and we'll be back in a minute. But let's run the music.
All right, bye.
Managed to read 42 books. That does sound quite a lot. I'm sure it's nothing compared to some people. I don't know if I'm a particularly quick reader. Definitely reading digitally, though, has been partly the making of me. You barely realise how much you're reading, because I've had problems with my hands. The rheumatism, whatever it is. I don't want to be holding a big heavy book or having to use 2 hands, but reading on my phone, I never thought I'd say that, being a librarian, but I really enjoy reading on my phone. Why do you not have a Kindle? Well, I have a Kindle app, but I have had a Kindle before now, and it's just extra things to carry around. I find reading on my phone really good, and I don't actually have, like, a big iPhone. I don't have a big screen. I have, I don't know what this type of iPhone is. It's just, it's perfectly big enough though. Well, Paul, as long as you enjoy it. I do. And I've got so many books on my phone I've not yet even read. And I bought a whole lot more recently. I really shouldn't, but, what sort of things? Well, having read My Policeman, it's inspired me to read more gay literature. So I bought more of that, but I've got plenty of horror. I've got loads of things to read, and a few more autobiographies. What are you reading now? What are you actually reading? I'm reading 3 books, maybe slightly more. I did start a couple of things which were kind of, I wouldn't say fallen by the wayside, but I'm reading the autobiography of Pam St Clement. She's an actress, a British actress. That's I can't remember how I bought that. Often I buy things because I'm triggered by, because I'm jumping off from something I'm reading. Like, maybe, particularly with autobiographies, you read, like reading Joan Collins made me want to get the Christopher Biggins one, which I said when we were talking. Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of good things I've got to read in 2023, but we'll see. Of course, there might be things that are yet to be released. You could have a new favourite book. I could, but as I say, I rarely go back to books except for a few, examples. And I've got so many, physical hard copy books I ought to read, but I don't know. I'm not sure. We'll see. Oh, it's like a library in here, Paul. Yeah, like a library or a bookshop. Yes, indeed, Paul. You should tell us what you're reading, Cromitty. Reading? I mainly read articles on the internet. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. Yes, well, I should read more fiction. You should.
So, having read My Policeman, it's kind of got me into these kind of gay love story type books. I'm reading one called When You Call My Name, which is set in New York in the very early 90s. So, you've still got the whole spectre of AIDS and stuff. And I guess this is written, again, for older teenagers, because the two main characters are two boys who I'm about 3/4 of the way through, and they have met each other. But for a lot of the story, you have a chapter with Ben and a chapter with Adam, and one of the boys has a relationship with a guy who then ends up in the hospital and reveals that he's he's HIV positive, but he's getting sick. And then the other one gets involved with the fashion. He's very into fashion, and his brother is sort of dating this girl who's a fashion photographer. And one of them I think grew up in New York, and the other one has come to New York, and it's all new to him. Yeah, but they have encountered each other, so I don't know if they're going to end up becoming friends by the end of the book. But again, it's very sort of it's quite short chapters. Yeah, I'm enjoying that. But I bought quite a few sort of. I'm naughty. I shouldn't be spending money on books, but digital books are often quite cheap. So,
yeah. I was going to ask you actually, because I don't know, but what's just an average price of a
sometimes around $5, sometimes $6 or $7. I mean, I think it can depend on the publishers. A lot of the things that the ones I've been buying have just been $4 or $5, and I found with the Miss Marple books that with Prime you've got the TV, you can watch films on Prime and all that sort of thing. I actually found there's a book section of Prime where there are books that you've got free access to on Prime. So I think that Nemesis I didn't have to pay a single penny for because it was considered part of my existing deal with.
Yeah, in a lot of ways I wasted my Prime membership because I never took advantage of those, and I should have, but I never did.
But I'm reading that book, and I'm also reading another book by the person who wrote My Policeman. It's called The Pools, and it's set in the 1980s. You do get chapters that are set earlier than that, but I think it seems to be all about a tragedy when a child or a teenager dies and how it affects the community. I'm enjoying that one. I got some more autobiographies on the go. I've got so many things, and there were a few things I started last year but never finished that I really ought to go back to.
Right.
I did get to the stage where I was reading more than just 3 or 4 books. I was reading like 7 or 8. And
oh my lord!
I'd spin round, but then inevitably some of the books I kind of get more into and kind of, I just want to finish this one now. And 1 or 2 drop by the wayside, so I need to go back to those. But anyway.
All right, well, I'm going to just say, because I know how things work here on the Shy Life podcast, I know even though it seems like we're about to end, I know for a fact we're coming back one last time. And when we do, I've got a question for you about books, all right?
Well, we'll say goodbye.
We'll say goodbye.
I'll be back.
Not really. No.
Not really.
Seems like it. Okay.
I gotta go now. Bye.
Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye.
It's been good, but yeah, definitely time to come home now.
Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye.
This show is part of the Pride 48 network. Find more shows over at pride48.com.
Oh dear, what's going on now? Oh, it's the Shy Life Podcast.
Let's go.
I have a voice. I have a voice.
You have a voice.
You have a voice. We have a voice.
We have a voice.
Unique voices in podcasting.
UnivazPods.net.
Okay, we're back. What's your question, Toppy?
All right, so I'm curious because you've indicated on this program that you do reread novels. And I just like to know, what is your most read novel? Which one have you read like maybe more than twice or who knows how many times? Is there one you can pick out?
Yes, definitely. It's the Tales of the City series.
No kidding.
Mr. Smallpin. I read those definitely like 3 or 4 times, and all of the series because he wrote the original 6 in the late 70s and 80s, but then he kind of added a few more recently. And
how interesting! Yeah,
the good thing is that he's on social media, and a few times I've got a couple of his books signed where I went, which a service he offers on his website, but I got him to sign them to Shy Yeti. So, and then I said, I took a picture of the book and said, thank you. I received the book, and he said, "Oh, nice to put a face to the Shy Yeti."
Oh, that's funny. Well, I could see why you'd read those for the content, but also they have cliffhangers.
Yes, yes, definitely. And
we both love our cliffhangers.
Yeah, they were written for newspapers, weren't they? Originally, the very first ones.
Yeah.
But again, short chapters, so very compulsive. It also goes back to the TV versions in the early 90s. I remember when I was living in a house and I wasn't out to my friend and sort of secretly videoing it and not mentioning what I was videoing. And then I read the books.
I've read the first three, I think, or maybe all the ones he wrote when he was writing for newspapers and serializing them. Anyways, the only 2 novels I've read more than once, there's only 2 of them. I've read Bram Stoker's Dracula twice, and I've read Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca twice.
I love Daphne du Maurier.
Yeah. But, come to think of it, Tales of the City would be a great reread. Absolutely.
There was one of the later books. There was a whole chapter which was I thought being very impressed with. I can't remember quite why, but it sort of told the story. I did a tweet and said how wonderful I thought, and it's nice when the person who writes the book is still alive to sort of and actually kind of responds and.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
That's cool. Well, I hope he keeps writing.
Yeah, he's supposed to be working on one at the moment. I know he started writing it sort of during the pandemic because he did a few live streams, but I guess it could well be coming out this year if he's got him because he and his husband live in London now. So I think his next book is part of the Tales of the City because he has written about 2 or 3 books that weren't part of that series, but mostly his books have been Tales of the City books, and he's writing one which fits in between between 2 of the books, rather than the ones he'd done more recently had been add-ons to sort of book 7, book 8, book 9, whatever. I think this one actually technically fits in between book 4 and 5, so it's particularly focusing on a character who you last saw in book 4. So I'm looking forward to. I hope it comes out this year.
Cool.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Alrighty, bye-bye.
We definitely will go now.
Okay, maybe.
Okay, I mean. Bye. Goodbye.
Paul. Yes, Yeti Uncle John. I've got some books for you. You got some books for me, have you? I really don't need more books. We have so many books, and Toby has loads of books. I mean, he has the bigger of the bedrooms in this place, and that's full of my books, but he has so many books. He has so many cookery books. Oh, yes, but you wait, you wait. You will love them. What? It's books for my own personal collection. Or why don't you just leave them in your collection and lend them to me? No. When I say in my personal collection, I mean in my storeroom of things that things you want to get rid of. Yes. Well, I'm not a comic book person, so trying to sell me copies of The Incredible Hulk where he's pink or something, it's not going to be something that you can sell to me. I'm sorry. No, I've got rid of most of those. You haven't been bothering Ryan again? No. But some planets, they're a bit more open-minded about their superheroes. They're more willing to try something new. Are they now? It's not that you've bought copies of comics that were printed with the wrong colours by mistake and would otherwise have been binned. Please don't say that. You ruined my my portfolio. Portfolio. What were you going to sell me? What was it that you wanted to pass my way? Well, look, I think you're just going to be taking the mickey out of me, so maybe I'll withdraw the offer. Well, you haven't even told me what the offer was. No. You're so suspicious of me, Paul. I shall take my wares elsewhere and, find somebody who more appreciates my unique taste in literature. But you've not read any of these things you've got in your lockup, or wherever it is you keep your books and your other bits and pieces. He's right, Paul. I'm going. Oh, dear, Yeti Uncle John. I know what I'm not appreciating. Oh, dear.
He ain't all that shy. No. I've heard him. Oh, Paul. He's so sweet. Dealy. Hi, Dealy.
God, is this show gonna end anytime soon?
This is just the weirdest thing I've ever heard.
Hey listeners, very quickly before I go, my friend Charlie, who I mentioned in this episode, asked me which of those 42 books were my favourite, my top 5. I think I did say My Policeman when we were talking with Toppy, but My Policeman is probably the one I enjoyed most, even though it was pretty tragic I've since read another book by that author. Another 4, probably Joyland by Stephen King. That was really good. Dance on My Grave by Aidan Chambers, another tragic gay love story. That was made into the film Summer of 85. I really like that one. And I've read another of that author's books. We've Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. And Celia Imrie's autobiography, The Happy Hoofer, that was also, really enjoyable. But I did read some good autobiographies last year. In fact, all of those 42 books were really good books, or I wouldn't have got through to the end of them. As I said before, I'm very good at not finishing books that I start if I don't like them. So, anyway, I thought I'd just share that with you, as Charlie had asked me. I guess those would be my top 5. Right, bye-bye.
Six, one.
611. 611. 611.
Wow. Really? No kidding.
Sorry, I just need to have a cough. I'll mute myself for a second.
Okay. Now, if you're talking, I can't hear you, so you might still be muted. I don't know.
Sorry. I don't think is it better now?
Oh, I hear you now. Yeah.
Come back. Honest, we won't come back. I'll stop recording so we can't come back.